Great. So let's start. Hello, everybody, for this event of the European Studies Center, which is the annual lecture of our center. And this is our kind of takes place during this last term of the year. It's always delivered by an eminent personality in academia, in politics, sometimes less and less, I think, currently. But for this year, it's a real pleasure to introduce our annual lecture speaker, Professor Jeff Colgan, who is a leading scholar in the fields of international relations, energy politics, and climate policy. He currently holds the Richard Holbrooke Professorship of Political Science and International and Public Affairs at Brown University, and he's also the director of the Climate Solutions Lab at Brown's Watson Institute for International and Public Affairs. Jeff Colgan's research tackles some of the most urgent global challenges of our time: how energy resources shape international conflict and cooperation, how climate change affects the international order, and how institutions can be designed to produce more effective global responses. His work is widely cited and deeply influential in both academic and policy circles. Among his many contributions, his recent book, Partial Hegemony, Oil Politics and International Order, has been particularly impactful. Published by Oxford University Press in 2021, the book offers a compelling theory of how global orders are maintained through informal, issue-specific leadership, what he calls partial hegemony. It has won numerous prestigious awards, including the Jervis Schroeder Best Book Award for the American Political Science Association's International History and Politics section, and the Best Book in Energy Politics for the American Energy Society. Congratulations, Jeff. His writings appear in major journals such as International Organization, International Security, International Studies, Quarterly, World Politics, Foreign Affairs. He is a respected voice in academic and public debates on energy security, climate diplomacy, geopolitical risks, and indeed much of his latest work also concentrates on the impact of the war in Ukraine, on energy security and energy costs. As for his academic background, he's got a PhD from Princeton University and a master's from the University of California, Berkeley, and has worked in organizations such as the World Bank and McKinsey & Company. This year, he's been with us in Oxford for the whole academic year, and this particular term, we are very pleased to have appointed him as our ESC visiting fellow. We are very fortunate to have you today deliver your insights on the topic of understanding climate-related disruption of global financial governance. Please join me in giving a warm welcome to Jeff Colgan.
Well, thank you so much. It's a pleasure to be here. It's a pleasure to be introduced so warmly. I'm often introduced as a scholar, but I don't think I've ever been introduced as an eminent personality. That is going to be right onto my CV. I love that. And I want to say, a special thank you to the St. Antony's and to ESC specifically for hosting me this term. It's been not only very nice to get to know some of the people here, but also it turns out very productive that I've been collaborating with members. And so it's kind of exactly what you hope for from a sabbatical leave. So can I get the slides up, hopefully? I want to share with you tonight some reflections on climate politics and global financial governance. And this is going to be kind of a broader talk than just a paper, but there is a paper underlying it, which is work that I've been doing with two postdocs of mine, Catherine Chalvinsky and Matthias Lyson. So I wanted to give them credit for the paper underlying. So, okay, so.
Went towards that's it.
There, yeah, perfect. Okay. Yes. Okay. So I want to start with, where we are in terms of ESC. Start with the idea that Europe is very much deeply integrated with multiple global systems, right? So one of which, from a climate perspective, of course, is most obvious that Europe is integrated into a global environmental system that ultimately supports all human life, all life on our planet. Europe is obviously not an island in that respect, right? It is connected to the world, but not just environmentally. Also, Europe is connected into a global industrial system that now has supply chains, as we know, that connect around the world, and a global financial system. And all three of those systems are going to be really important to the topic that I want to speak to today. But the second thing to note about this is that while Europe is very much deeply integrated in the rest of the world, it is not just homogenous and the same as the rest of the world. And in some really important ways, in ways that I find kind of lovely, Europe is quite different, right? So for instance, Europe sees ESG investing quite differently than the rest of the world, right? So ESG, those of you who don't get caught up in acronyms of investing, is environmental, social, and governance indicators, and it is sort of a shorthand or proxy for investing that has a more climate conscious focus, or focus on the risks associated with it. And so I'm going to show that more quantitatively later on, but there is very much a difference in the way Europe thinks about how the financial sector should engage with the environment or environmental linked assets versus, say, my home continent, North America, or even the rest. It's quite different. Okay, so second thing I wanted to do was to say, okay, well, let's recognize the moment that we're in, right? So we're in a moment where we have some real disruptions in climate politics. Most maybe notably is in my home country of the United States, where the Trump administration is certainly very disruptive. He is creating all kinds of headwinds for decarbonization, for renewables, for clean energy, for battery technology, et cetera, domestically within the United States. He is also taking actions that hurt kind of a global approach to climate change, both from a diplomatic perspective, of course, by withdrawing from Paris and then potentially even from the UNFCCC itself, and with an attack on climate science, which has been, partially but significantly funded from U.S. And that money is very much drying up, and a lot of capability is being lost, so to speak. And then, of course, there's, in addition to that, some ripple effects of the Trump administration outside of the U.S. borders for politics in other countries, right? So in this country, the Reform Party is taking inspiration from some of what they're seeing. There are other right-wing parties that are emboldened by what the behaviors that they see. But this is a complicated fact because it's not just one way. There's also some center-left parties that are gaining from the Trump effect as well, right? So my other home country is Canada, where I was born, and in Canada's most recent election, the center-left party, the Liberals, were able to reverse a massive deficit in the polls, about 25 percentage point swing to actually win a most recent election. So, and they did that basically on the back of kind of an anti-Trump sentiment. And it doesn't help, of course, that Trump was talking about making Canada the 51st state. So there you go. So ripple effects around that. And so the other thing I would say is that quite apart from the Trump administration itself, there are also some economic headwinds for the green transition. And most notably, I would say the increase in interest rates, that we are moving out of a long period of very low interest rates into a period where interest rates are higher, and that disproportionately affects clean tech, which tends to be capital intensive, much more so than, say, fossil fuel power plants, which run, have a a variable cost associated with the fuel, whereas say solar and wind are entirely fuel costs are zero, but everything associated with it is capital and therefore sensitive to interest rates. So that hurts, and that's given rise, we think, to or at least given fuel to this idea of climate realism, right? So an ideology, or at least a policy approach that is being championed at the U.S. Council on Foreign Relations right now, but also here in Britain and in Europe, where this notion of climate realism is sort of taking hold. This idea that, look, we're not going to make the Paris climate targets, probably true, and therefore we need a whole new kind of political way of thinking about that. So that's something that, again, Federica and I have been doing a lot of thinking on. And so one thing that I thought I would do is to sort of summarize some of the conversations that I've had here in Oxford, and I want to give credit to some of the people in the room that have helped me think about this. But one thing that has been helpful is to try to identify, okay, so what does political science bring to the table when we talk about climate politics, right? So we know that economists have their angle on this. We know that, of course, atmospheric chemists bring something to the table about climate change. What does political science offer? And I would, boil down and synthesize a very large literature to 5 key points. Of course, I'm not going to get everything, but 5 key points that I want to emphasize. One, and this on some level should be deeply obvious, is that climate change or climate solutions are deeply political. This is not simply an issue of economics. It is not simply an issue of technology or science. This is a political thing. And so this might sound obvious, but it's tempting, I think, for, say, atmospheric scientists to say, well, look, we've got a carbon budget of X number of greenhouse gas tons, and we need to stick within that budget to meet our goals, and therefore make the politics fit that problem. And that turns out to be potentially not such a great way of thinking about the problem that, in fact, I would argue for the primacy of politics. That if you want to get people to decide to take on costly actions to change behavior, you have to really start thinking about political coalitions and not simply say, the planet needs this to happen. We've tried that for roughly 30 years and it hasn't worked very well so far. And so we need to really grapple with what the various challenges are. Okay, very quickly on the other points. Climate politics can be seen as a 2-level game. It's a classic idea of an international game and a domestic level game. And while the international game of COP meetings and Paris Agreement, et cetera, those tend to attract a lot of the headlines, but the real binding force for climate change tends to be at the domestic level. Domestic politics are really important to understanding this problem, not only in terms of what promises governments are able to make at those international summits, but even more importantly, what promises they're able to keep after they've made them. And so that domestic politics is. A third thing that's important is the distributional politics, right? So distributional politics all the way down. When we think about this global challenge, distributional politics is there at the international level, but it's also there at the national, the subnational, the local level. There are going to be fights around siting. Well, if you want to put up a wind turbine down the street, there's going to be some local politics involved. And so who gets what? Where does it happen? What are the benefits? What are the costs? This is going to be distributional sort of frictions and contestation all the way down. So material incentives matter a lot, but point number 4, they're not the only thing. Ideational politics matter as well. It's ideational politics under the ideas, identities, culture war, partisanship. These all are also going to map onto climate politics in ways that are not wholly determined by the underlying material. And then fifth, and certainly not least important, is the high stakes and high uncertainty of what climate change means for social behavior. Right? So anybody who's read some of the IPCC reports knows that there's going to be high stakes in terms of droughts and sea level rise and heat waves, et cetera. But then there's a next level of, well, what are the consequences of that for human migration, for pandemics, for civil unrest, for potential civil wars. And those uncertainties are very large, but the stakes are very, very large. So that's something that we are still grappling with. And frankly, we are running a large experiment on a planet to just, nobody really knows what's going to happen. Okay, so the project that I've been working on over the past year while I've been here at Oxford are following sort of one piece of work that I've been doing is an investigation on the degree to which an international agreement like the Paris Agreement can actually impact firm behavior, corporate behavior. And so in particular, we were looking at the vehicle manufacturing sector, and then we looked at the 12 firms that make up 80% of car manufacturing. And the question was, how much does the 2015 Paris Agreement actually affect? Fortunately, the answer is not very happy, and the degree to which it moves, we don't see a lot of it. Okay. Second topic is climate realism, and this is one that I introduced briefly before, but this idea that because of the moment that we're in, we should start to think about climate realism in a different way, and that various folks are arguing for that. I have some concerns, or we have some concerns that Federica and I have been working on about what that actually means, and in particular in the US context, the idea that we can create a bipartisan approach, which is certainly something I'm sympathetic to, but a bipartisan approach that Republicans could sign on to with climate realism. There is no evidence that that's something that's actually possible to do while the Republican Party are in the thrall of a man who calls climate change a hoax, right? The basic science of climate. And so making that move to some kind of more moderate or centrist position, where the right wing has moved as far to the right as we can, at least on this particular issue of climate change, is not necessarily the right strategy. And then there's this third project that I'd like to talk to you in a little bit more detail about tonight, which is global financial crisis. And I'll say more about that. But if you want to think about these three projects as linked, think about, okay, well, one is on the current approach, which isn't going all that well. And so the second possibility is lowering ambitions to climate mitigation in recognition of the difficult politics of that. Don't love that approach either. And so this one is really sort of the search for options, search for alternative approaches, and particularly transactional. So what's happening in finance? It turns out that climate effects on, say, the international trade system are by now, I think, reasonably well recognized, at least by specialists like me who pay a lot of attention to this, that look, climate change is going to matter for international trade. So we're already seeing things like the European Union's CBAM, right, the Carbon Border Adjustment Mechanism, as a clear implication of look, climate change has affected how Europe is thinking about trade, and that is translated into policy. It's less clear for the finance sector how climate change is going to affect the governance of that sector, or is already affecting that. And that's on one hand, right? So there's a certain lack of clarity, but there's also a lot going on. There's a blizzard of different climate initiatives, right? So net zero initiatives, Paris Agreement, there's green industrial policy, there's carbon accounting, there's carbon disclosure projects, there's all kinds of different things. Some of these are happening here at Oxford, where we have various net zero projects on campus, which is lovely. But so much going on, there's a question of sort of what does this all add up to, and how should we think about it? And third sort of contextual point of this is everywhere, especially in the United States, the political pendulum swings generate uncertainty for finance, right? So when the political pendulum swings, say, on a topic like ESG, you have for a moment a huge influx of assets, of real dollars going into funds that are at least labeled ESG funds or sustainable funds. And then, there is a pushback from mainly the right in various countries, especially the United States, where there are, in fact, state attorney generals that are suing Vanguard, BlackRock, various other major economic asset holders to stop doing it, to stop supporting this idea of ESG investing. And so you get a swing back, and there's actually asset flow back out of those funds. And so this political pendulum has swings, has consequences for financial markets. And so that means that there's kind of the rise and fall of various movements, investing fads, and so let me give a few examples of that. One is that states are doing a lot, right? So this is a graph of various green financial policy measures that national governments have adopted in the years sort of since 2015, and you can see sort of steady upward trend that there's more state behavior on that. So that's one thing that's happening. But there's also non-state action, right? So this is a graph of the signatories, which are private actors, typically firms, that are signing on to the UN principles for responsible investment, right? And it goes, up by thousands over the time period covered in this graph, which is, you can't read that at the back, sort of 2006 to 2020. You also have U-turns, right? So it's not all just linear movement in terms of one percent. And so what this shows actually is so states that are members of the Energy Charter Treaty, the ECT. And over time, right, you can see at the beginning of this graph on the left-hand side, there is a burst of states that sign on to become members of the Energy Charter Treaty in the 90s. This was particularly after collapse of the Soviet Union, and there was sort of a need for how do we understand governance of energy investment. And so there's a burst of energy or a burst of membership in this treaty, and then around 2015 you start to see a decline, right? Where suddenly there's a real concern about how the Energy Charter Treaty can be weaponized against states that want to support clean energy, and this is costly, and so then states start to withdraw. So there's that going on as well. And then, as I said, regional variation in the world about how the finance sector is behaving in response to environmental thinking. And so here you see Europe has this massive inflow of money to sustainable funds, whereas the money coming from the United States, which is actually a much larger pool, well, it is a larger pool. I wouldn't say it's a much larger pool, but it's a larger pool of underlying assets. There's much less flow into these types of funds, and then even less so in the other parts. All right. So Europe is the main driver behind this interest in sustainable. And then, of course, we have new risks as well. And this map shows changing insurance practices, right? So at the state level within the United States, some states are having serious problems with their housing markets because of the natural disasters that are getting bigger and nastier as time goes on in a way that is, of course, directly linked to climate change. And so states like Louisiana, Florida, and California are all at the point where private insurers, like Allstate, major insurance companies, are saying, we don't want to be a part of this state. We're going to pull out. We're just not going to insure anybody in this state. I'm starting to see how this bites even in my home state of Rhode Island, this tiny little state up there in the Northeast, where you think the hurricane risk is pretty small. But even, I'm starting to hear from neighbors, people who moved into my neighborhood said, I can't get an insurance company to give me home insurance. So this is really starting to bite in ways that I think will only get more serious. And not just me, Jerome Powell, the chair of the Fed, has said that there's going to be parts of the United States uninsurable within 10 years. So this is coming our way. So I'm not going to take you through a full academic paper on how to do this, but let me just give you kind of a taste of what my co-author and I have been talking about, co-authors, I should say. So the core question we have is, how is global financial governance changing over time in the context of this rising salience of climate change? And here I'm talking about sort of political salience of climate change. And we have a background assertion, basically, that the political salience of climate change has grown significantly since 2015 for a number of reasons, but probably most notably because that's when the Paris Agreement was signed, and that became sort of the manifestation for a set of trends that support, kind of growing awareness among ordinary people, but especially among policymakers, that this was an issue that they needed to take very seriously. And we are not claiming, there's no causal claim here, that the rising salience of climate change is causing the change in global financial governance. We think that that's actually, that there is it is plausible that that is what's actually happening, but we're not going to test that. That's actually not the argument that we're going to make, because there's lots of things that are happening in this period. And of course, one of the other things that's happening is an increased rivalry between the United States and China, and sort of return to geopolitics in various ways. We're going to not touch that. What we are going to do is make two basic arguments. One is a descriptive argument, and the other one is kind of more a conceptual one. The descriptive argument is that the governance efforts for climate-related asset differentiation in the financial system have increased over time. And so I'm going to define what I mean by asset differentiation in just a sec. But that's a sort of first claim. So this sort of the efforts to do that are going up over time. And then the second claim is that to understand all of what's happening, part of the examples that I've just given, we need to have two quite different conceptual models, theoretical models of change, to explain what we're seeing in terms of the change in global finance. So, first part of that, asset differentiation. What we mean by that is favoring or varying the financial terms of assets based on their expected environmental effects. Right. So, for instance, favoring renewables over fossil fuels, divesting from fossil fuels is sort of the more extreme example of that. But generally, treating assets differently from each other in ways that are not directly linked to the kind of risk-adjusted return on investment, right? So the sort of classic neoclassical expectation is like, well, we trade capital equally from risk-adjusted return. What we're saying is actually there's an effort here to treat assets differently based on their environmental characteristics, right? So some possible examples of that are fossil fuel divestment, ESG investing, and I talked about how that's different from trade, so I'll skip that. I should add some caveats to this. What we are not measuring is how much asset differentiation is actually going on. So, for instance, there is a large fossil fuel divestment movement going on. We can even quantify how big that fossil fuel divestment movement is in terms of purported assets that have moved from one category to another. What we can't know very easily is what's that actually mean for the cost of capital in different asset types. That is a very, very tricky question to answer, and that's not what we're going to try to do. So it is quite possible that things that are labeled sort of ESG investing or sustainable investing, this might be all greenwashing in the sense that this is not, there's not a lot of material difference between assets. But there is something going on here, and we are interested in the governance efforts, say. And many of these efforts are contested, they're incomplete, but they are nonetheless happening. I think having some significant. Okay, so one of the two conceptual models for thinking about this, and then I'm going to sort of wrap up with this and stop. So the two models that we are using to think about, one is kind of like the classic model that if you ask sort of a neoclassical economic thinker, how does policy affect markets, you would get some version of this, right? Where policymakers at states, national governments, or IOs, they make policies, and that trickles down to market actors. Market actors respond to policy change. Right? So this is a very top-down kind of process, vertical model. And in the world we live in, some states and some IOs are going to have strong climate preferences. So there's going to be a governance effort for asset differentiation. And then market participants are going to react to what those governance efforts are, what the incentives that governance efforts are created for. Whereas in other states and IOs that don't have those same preferences, they won't try these governance efforts, and so you don't have this effort for asset differentiation. Okay. But there's a second model going on here, which is that what we call a horizontal model. And we started by calling this kind of a bottom-up model. What we saw were that it wasn't just state governments, national governments that were making these decisions. There were also universities, churches, wealthy individuals, people who wanted to change financial governance sort of on their own accord. And that meant that there was sort of all kinds of different social campaigns. Then there were governance initiatives. There's now like a whole category of net zero alliances in the banking sector, the insurance sector, in central banks. There's all kinds of different green initiatives. And those types of initiatives involve and get started by actors at all levels, whether they are international organizations, state governments, subnational actors, private firms, individuals, NGOs, all kinds of different actors that are involved. And the principal contestation there is horizontal, right? Between actors who have strong climate preferences and actors that don't, that are not keen to see asset differentiation. And so that is the second way in which these governance efforts for asset differentiation. And so empirically, what we did was look around to see what types of efforts were happening. We looked at 3 different categories. So there's actors based on who was doing it, right? So were states involved, were international organizations involved, or were kind of all other actors, right? So NGOs, private firms, et cetera. That gives you your vertical columns. And then we looked in 4 different types of activities: national economic policies, international coordination, carbon accounting, and climate conscious financing. And very briefly, you can imagine sort of mapping things that we see in the real world into these categories, right? So the Inflation Reduction Act in the United States is a clear example of like a state policy that is national economic policy. International coordination, a good example of this is JETP, which is the joint, I'm always forgetting this one, joint,
The Just Energy Transition.
Yes, Just Energy Transition program. And then, the coal divestment campaign that was really started by NGOs. And so what we actually did, and I don't expect you to read this, is to map all of the different activities, the major activities, and fill up this list. And if you're interested in that, that actually occupies, like 80% of the paper that we've written. I'm happy to share that as well. Bottom line, many activities across all active types. And then we said, okay, now let's go back to those 2 conceptual models that I talked about before and locate how we would explain each one of these activities, the governance efforts in the finance sector. And some of them are well explained by the kind of traditional vertical top-down policymaking model, but others are not. They're much more kind of a bottom-up process where others are involved. The litmus test of that is there state binding policy involved or not? right? So if there's a binding policy from a national government, vertical model. If there isn't, then it's more like a horizontal model. And then there are some things that are kind of interesting that are well explained or reasonably well explained by both models. And so one can interpret them. So to wrap up, climate politics is a kind of multi-speed phenomenon. Even when the Paris Agreement may or may not be delivering kinds of results that we want to see to stabilize our climate, there are many actors out there, including those in the finance sector, that are reaching for different levers to pull to try to change behavior in their own sector, whether that's in finance, whether it's manufacturing. Europe is embedded in multiple global systems and therefore, at some level, has a really important play as a distinctive actor, right? That this is a special region that has been a climate leader for quite a long time, but it also needs to combine both idealism and a really hard-nosed approach to understanding kind of where Europe fits into the global economy. And political science, I think, brings this necessary perspective on climate mitigation. For the reasons that I outlined before, with the kind of 5 different points, but in particular for the finance sector, both vertical and horizontal models are needed to understand. Thank you so much, and I look forward to your questions.
Thank you very much, Jeff. That was great. So let's move to the questions now from the audience. Already there are already 2 hands, so let's start with you.
I'm John Huffmeyer. I used to be at the business school here, and now I'm at the Center for Mutual and Co. Business. I realize you're not an economist or a political scientist, but I just need guidance as an economist from someone like you. So if you assume that Goldman Sachs has been saying we need 30 trillion US dollars to make the investments to the sector, the private sector, that you just described. And let's assume there's 600 trillion US dollars of total wealth in the world, of which probably only 150 trillion would be equity related. As you've watched Trump 2, I'm not going to ask you for figures here. Just how many years in a range or on a scale of incredibly difficult to do what we need to do, where it's still possible. How do you feel Trump has influenced this environment?
So, in terms of doing what we need to do, that's a great place to start, because if we interpret that to mean sticking to the climate, the Paris climate goals of 2 degrees Celsius or less, well below 2 degrees Celsius, that was already very hard to imagine happening even before Trump came in. And I wish I wasn't saying that. I hate being pessimistic about it. But it just gets more and more implausible. We have these nice graphs of what we've been emitting into the graph and what we need, what we've been emitting into the atmosphere, and then what we need to do to get to the Paris goals starts to look like complete, dropping off a cliff, right? That we need to pull back. And so we weren't likely to do it even before. We are much less likely to now, I think, with the signals that the Trump administration has been sending to Wall Street in particular, that, look, this is not a priority for me, don't do it or you'll get attacked, right? So Goldman and various other actors have been doing, just what many other actors have been doing, just scrubbing anything to do with climate change off their websites. They don't want to talk about it. They're just interested in private sector investment. Is there still a business case for solar, wind, batteries? Yes, absolutely. And even, I think, for nuclear fission and other technologies. And so those will continue on. The world is not lost in that sense. But in terms of a timeline for mobilizing that huge amount of capital, and I don't know whether it's 30 trillion or something else, right? Goldman and others have estimates. But are we, motivating anywhere close to that? No. I think it's the truth of it. And there isn't a clear timeline. I mean, I don't think anybody has the answer for when and for how long that takes. So we're not on the right path. zero. And in particular, in the fossil fuel sector, our system as a whole is rewarding fossil fuel companies by continuing to put capital into oil and gas and not put their capital into renewables. And that's what the market incentives are for those companies. And so they are understandably, frustratingly, but understandably responding in that exact way, right? Where BP and others are saying, well, we're not going to do renewables, we're going to plow into. So that's on us collectively to try to change that system. And so this is where the search for leverage to pull, I think, is really important. But the current political environment definitely makes it.
David Madden, CSOS. I liked where you ended your talk. The real surge for weapons we can use to build an international movement to combat Trumpism, and using ideas from people, from NGOs, and not silly ideas, but well worked out ideas. And my candidate would be regenerative agriculture, i.e., to since factory farms produce more greenhouse gases than the entire world transport systems. That's a pretty good place to start in tackling it.
Yeah. I'm so glad you brought it up because I've actually been talking with some of my colleagues about how political scientists, being urban elite type people, often do not focus enough on agriculture and the importance of agriculture in the sort of decarbonization picture. I think it's hugely important. I find regenerative agriculture both inspiring and a big question mark. I actually just don't know whether this is a big part of the solution, or it's a small part of the solution, or it's really not. It's a nothing burger. I don't know. I don't have the expertise on that, but I certainly have hopes. And it does make a lot of sense that the kinds of approaches that people are talking about being able to absorb a lot of carbon dioxide back into soils, it seems like, in principle, it seems like a very, very promising. Thanks. Yes, Stephen.
You was wondering, as you mentioned before about how this attempt to do environmental friendly actions may be seen as a greenwashing itself, which already it even complicates the picture even more, seeing what Trumpism is doing right now. I was wondering things okay, fossil fuel is one thing, but also even the effort to do renewable energies, for example, batteries in itself, has been creating another source of problem by having nickel, issues, currently destroying another biodiversity in the name of doing green. How do you perceive this? This additional, layer of problems on top of what's already been happening.
Yeah, right. It was an easy problem already, so let's make it harder. So there's a couple things you mentioned there, right? So one is the challenge of greenwashing, and actors who are saying they're doing green things and actually aren't, right? They're just not walking the walk, or what they're doing isn't having the effect that they claim that it's having. And that's something that's not a new problem. It's got a new label in terms of greenwashing, but corporations have been doing PR spin for a long time. It's not new, and so we should stay on that problem. But it is fundamentally something that we should meet with sort of the right level of policy skepticism and to a certain degree regulation, right? The second issue you mentioned is about how even renewables and the technologies that we want for climate purposes, they don't come as a free lunch, that they have their own environmental issues. And you're 100% right about that. But I do think this is where environmentalists, and I include myself in that category, but we need to kind of get real about the trade-offs that we're managing. And that there are going to be tensions, kind of green on green type of tensions between, I think the one in this country that's famous is this, $100 million pounds for spending to save this bat, right? That it's, and you're going to have to help me on this one, right? But there's a high-speed rail that's being built, and there's something like $100 million, 100 million pounds being spent on nets to protect this various kinds of bats, or a kind, a specific species of bats, and people are sort of rightly kind of scratching their head and saying, really, do we need to spend 100 million pounds to save bats or this kind of bat? And am I in favor of biodiversity? Yes, absolutely. And yet we really are going to face some hard choices, I think, about if we want to meet the climate goals that we have laid out and to avoid some of the more catastrophic outcomes. We can't have all good things. We have painted ourselves into a very, very tight corner. And so we are going to have to figure out which to prioritize, even within the economic, even within the environmental. That's the hard.
Yes.
So this goes off that question.
Yeah.
So I'm sure you know about the abundance agenda book in the U.S., right? And one of the arguments that they make in that book is essentially that there have environmental politics people have put up all of these regulations that then make it extremely costly to build housing.
Yeah.
And then, so there's this argument about sort of, and I guess when I think about in the US, the lack of support for climate policy, it seems to me that these things aren't disconnected, that there might be ways in which some of the policy choices, exactly what you just described, are the kind of things that give fodder to people who maybe are a little bit skeptical to start.
Yes.
And I wondered if you think, I guess as a non-environmental politics people, are there people who are thinking about those sort of from a research scholarly perspective, and also if you think there is really any appetite to shifting the conversation, because I think often people are very stringent and we must save this bat and we must have very clear climate regulations, and so it might cost a lot of money to build housing, and then we get to this point.
Yeah. So I would say two things on that. There is, first of all, there's an empirical claim, right? The abundance book claims look, environmental regulation is the problem, or it's part of the problem. And there's a real question there about is that actually true? Can you find an example of environmentalists gone mad? I'm sure there is an example like that, and it makes for great reading, especially for wrote the book. But the pushback that I've seen from my colleagues in sort of the environmental politics space is that, look, most of what's blocking the kinds of things that we want to build, whether that's high-speed rail or solar and wind or or housing, whatever, it's not actually the environmental regulations. It tends to be other forces, including the fossil fuel industry, that are often the real opponents, or so. If we want to build wind turbines, or if we want to build EV chargers, if you go and look deeply into those cases, it's not the sort of the local environmentalist that's blocking it. It's the forces on sort of the other side of the equation, which is very often the fossil fuel industry. So I think there is a deeper question there. I actually just don't know the answer of who's right on that one in terms of how much of a problem sort of the environmental kind of counterforce to building things is. My gut instinct is that there is something to this abundance argument, but it is, of course, not just about environmental stuff. It's also, like when we're talking about housing, a whole lot of other regulations that prevent housing, and so there's a larger. Not sure if that fully answers your question, but that was my sense.
Yes.
Sure, about that sort of, you mentioned these sort of lawsuits that some green investors have faced in the United States,
Yes.
and comparing that with the pressure in sort of European countries for more responsible, net zero alliance that Tom was involved in. So I guess I'm curious about what you think about the sort of, does this create pressures for sort of regionalism, and do you see evidence of this? Is this kind of on the horizon in terms of are there actually implications for the sort of the structuring of financial markets, or maybe that's just way too that's off in the future.
No, I think, and anecdotally, we do see those pressures, right? When we have, German funds, for instance, as one, I'm forgetting the name of it now, but just in the last couple of weeks, of the headline, but a German fund, divesting from Exxon and another oil company because they hadn't moved fast enough on their time, right? So this is exactly the kind of thing that the, Arkansas Attorney General is like suing people for doing, or the Texas one, and so we are starting to see a real transatlantic rift on exactly this question. Now, how big is that rift? I think at this point it's still fairly small, but one thing that is notable is something that has been long a complaint if you are a European fossil fuel company, right? So BP, Shell, Total, and others, they are, as a measure of their price earnings ratio, they are wildly undervalued by the market compared to Exxon, Chevron, and other American oil and gas companies, right? So because there seems to be, within Europe, much less appetite for pension funds and others who have the money to invest to put it with an oil and gas company, right? They don't want to do that, right? There's this stigma attached, there's pressure not to do it from their, constituents. Whereas in the United States, Americans are still, broadly speaking, of the attitude, we don't care, burn the planet, let's invest in oil and gas, right? That's sort of where we are as a country. I'm stylizing maybe just a little, but so there is, I think, some difference. Are we seeing, wildly different financial governance because of that? I think at this point it's still, fairly small. That London in particular is very attentive to whatever New York is doing. Yes.
No, that's you. I'm looking at you. Yeah.
Thank you so much for your presentation. This also inspired my research a lot.
Can you speak up, please?
My also focus on voluntary climate initiatives. So my question is that, do you think that there is some still institutional interactions between this horizontal model and these vertical models? Because during my interview with these voluntary initiatives, the people they told me that they believe this theory of change, which means that if you want to bring some like a large scale impact, you have to involve the government. You have to involve the state actors and to provide enough incentive to this market actors. Otherwise, that they can just have a limited impact on this small scope of action. So I wonder your opinion about this interaction between non-state actors and state.
Yeah, it's a great question. I do think that often the initiatives, the governance initiatives that start out as voluntary, start out as kind of bottom-up grassroots initiatives, ultimately either have from the outset or develop the ambition to become mandatory state governance, right? State policy that has sort of binding teeth behind the regulation. And that's a subject that governance, private governance. There's a whole literature in IR about how of this process of people who have studied how entrepreneurial actors that are starting with voluntary regulation ultimately becomes binding. But I guess one thing to say is that, like, yes, there may be over time a trajectory where something starts as horizontal and becomes kind of in the vertical model more understandable. But there are many things that stay, maybe forever in the kind of horizontal model of viewing things where it's not driven by binding state policy, but rather by governance arrangements that may or may not involve states, but certainly doesn't involve binding.
Hi, I'm Claudia. I'm a postdoc at the Climate Policy Hub, and I really like the horizontal model that we had. I had a question about the conceptualization of the state that you said. So, in general, like financial regulation or financial governance is something that's entrusted to central banks in the country or financial regulators. And
so central banks could be like a part of the state, but central bank independence, particularly in countries in a Western neoliberal context, they are very like staunchly dependent about the fact that we will do what is within our mandate, and that's usually like preserving monetary stability, financial stability, and like saying too much on climate or doing too much on climate policy making would be risking like losing their credibility. So like where do you think central banks fit into this whole thing? Because it's a very different story. Like the ECB is one of the most independent central banks, but it's also a very vocal advocate of the fact that it does impact their mandate and they do need to do active stuff there. But then the Fed is also a very independent central bank, and that's on a different kind of a analysis. So yeah, I just wanted to ask that.
Yeah, thank you so much for asking. I mean, actually, even just today, there was an article in the Financial Times about how the Central Bank of England, right, the Bank of England, is dealing with this exact issue where, at least the staff of the Bank of England felt that climate change was really being prioritized under Mark Carney, not so much under Andrew Bailey. And so the reason I mention it is that it's not so much about what I think central banks have a role. It's the central banks themselves are still trying to figure out what is their role. And I think we do see some of that political pendulum that I mentioned. It matters for the central banks as well, although of course central banks say, oh no, we're apolitical and independent, all of that. But they're not really, in the sense that they live in the society that they're embedded within, and they're affected by it. And so we do see some of that same swing even affecting. But this goes back a little bit to Amanda's question around sort of the transatlantic differences as well, right? That as you say, the ECB and the Federal Reserve have quite different views about how much they should be concerned about climate risk to the financial system. And kind of who's right about that is something that I guess only time can really tell. But this is very much what's on our mind as one of the sort of motivating examples of thinking about the horizontal model, where it's not just that, the national government of either the United States or the EU said to the central bank, this is what we're going to now change your role in climate change. The statutes haven't changed at all, but there is some sort of other action happening here that matters to global financial governance, and it's swung a little bit over time, but it is definitely not the sort of traditional top-down.
Two issues really. One, you've likened the sort of play around ESG and the sort of the growing rift, but also the soft pedaling to an extent, which is more generalized. And I was just thinking about a comparison with defense industries, which have also been sort of put to one side by investors because they're not socially sustainable, they're not good stuff. Geopolitics is now driving that. Can you imagine that if climate change continues as it does, you get the sort of effects you've got in the US on insurance, for example, that you might see a comparable review of current sort of more negative attitudes to ESG. The second thing, you haven't spoken, you talked about your 3 projects here, and you slightly dismissed the impact of Paris on industry. And I wondered if you could, if you wouldn't mind expanding a little bit on that, because excuse me, certainly reading the media, you get the impression that, at least in the auto industry, whether it's Paris or something else, you are seeing an evolution which is essentially Paris focused, whether it's driven by Paris or by other factors, where the traditional auto industries, particularly in the US, and in Europe, are working very hard to recover a position as compared with, say, China.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so thanks for that. The paper on the Paris impact, first, we sort of started with this idea that, yes, it is clearly the case that there are more electric vehicles over time, right? So that there is something happening here. But how much of that can we attribute to the Paris Agreement versus, say, technological improvements and other factors. And this turned out to be just a devil of a paper. In fact, if I could go back in time, I would just tell myself, don't even do this paper. This is just going to be a nightmare because the causal inference problem is such a difficult one. But what we've done as best we can with each of the 12 firms that we were looking at. So these are around the world, 3 Japanese ones, a number of European-based ones, as well, is sort of look at how they changed their behavior, not only how they talked about what they were doing in terms of, when they were speaking on earnings calls with analysts, but then also how did they invest their money, retooling their factories to try to change their product, and then ultimately, like, what was the mix of their product sales, right? Down the road, did they start to switch towards products that were not solely dependent on oil and gas as their sort of fundamental fuel, right? So electric vehicles, plug-in hybrids, but not just hybrids. It has to be plug-in hybrids and alternative hybrid vehicles. And we just, unfortunately, so of the 12, we said, look, there's 2 that we could maybe make the case that there is actually something going on here. The Paris actually seem to have motivated, they changed the way they talk, they set targets in a way that's reasonably consistent. But for the other 10, we really struggled to see much evidence that they were changing their behavior because of Paris. Now, did they change their behavior over time? Absolutely. And especially in the US, they changed their behavior almost, again, sort of who was president at various times mattered a lot. So when Trump was president the first time around, you had firms like GM joining the lawsuit, the DOJ lawsuit against California that was trying to raise their fuel standards. And then the moment Biden gets elected, GM says, yeah, we don't want to be part of that litigation at all. And the point of that anecdote really is to say, like, yes, companies are very attentive to national regulations, to national policy, but the degree to which it was actually that went back to Paris, we had a much harder time kind of satisfying ourselves that this was really being driven. I should say that the example, one of the cases that is maybe the exception is BMW, where if you looked, for instance, at their earnings calls, they do start to talk about climate change much more directly after 2015. There's like a very clear sort of spike, and they continue on with that. They start setting more targets for electric vehicles. And so there's like a much more plausible case that at least in that particular case that Paris had something. So I don't want to say like, Paris did nothing, don't want to be too gloomy on it, but as a case of impact, did not leave us terribly enthusiastic.
Defense.
Oh, defense. Sorry, I didn't answer your question at all. But apologies. Yeah, so I mean, I think it's actually quite striking to see how the reputation of arms manufacturers have been rehabilitated in ways that frankly, I kind of agree with. And could this happen again in, say, state like Louisiana, which is a very fossil fuel heavy state, but also has a housing insurance market that is collapsing right now? One could imagine sort of people saying, maybe we overdid our antipathy to anything related to climate change. It's possible. Is it likely? I don't know. None of us has a crystal ball on that. But the idea that there is going to be serious swings with political fads, that I think is certainly the case. We already have evidence of that happening, and every reason to expect that will happen and continue.
Thanks, Jeff. I take away from the talk that you gave us, and especially sort of picking up on the diagrams at the center of the paper that underlines the talk, the fact that we really can only, have a go at the time of battle if the state is serious about this. I think that it seems to me, and what you just said, for example, about the signal of Paris and how firms in the vehicle, in automobile sector only responded when the state took, the Paris Agreement seriously, suggests that really without the state, was going to be much harder. It is possible because of what you suggested in terms of the horizontal way of dealing with climate through creative alternative units of action. But it seems like that the horizontal model assumes that the vertical model has broken. And so thinking about that and thinking about the fact that surely we have other strategies that we can use and we can sort of use the horizontal model that you propose for climate action, that comes with the, the trade-off of having to rely on a lot of forces that democratically, the way we understand, the way we control the state, we cannot control. If Bloomberg decides to go and solve, climate or to, compensate the absence of the United States government, the USAID, sure, fine, it's great, it's very altruistic, but it means that we're putting all our eggs in one individual that can wake up tomorrow and be like, actually, I'm not interested. So the question I want to ask, and it's a hard question, it's an unfair question, and I don't think there is a real answer, but I want to hear your thoughts on this. It's like, how much does opening up to all these other strategies to climate, in the absence of some states not really taking seriously the battle and creating gaps and vacuums like the United States right now, really is sort of like the applicable way to do it? If we believe that at the end of the day, the end game is to democratically provide welfare for everyone, right? So in a world in which the end goal, or we would want to strive for, protecting people because everyone has a right to have a stable climate, a stable life, there is an innate democratic thought behind that, right? Because behind the solution to climate change, there is an innate democratic thought. So how do we do this in a world in which, however, the strategies from the horizontal model that you propose may not be democratic at all?
Right. So you want me to solve multiple problems at the same time, which is fair.
This question is essentially like, and it's, in some ways, it's a simple but still unfair question, which is, to what extent in the current world as we see it developing right now, with climate change accelerating, democracy plays a role?
Yeah. So a couple of thoughts. One is that your starting premise is, look, we go to the horizontal model, because the vertical model is failing. And we can't really get very far without state government action. And I kind of I agree with, I at least partially agree with that. But there's one point that I would say matters a lot, where there's a big difference between having states that say, look, we need to work with the private sector, we need to work with civil society, we need to coordinate our initiatives in a way that brings in other actors that aren't part of the formal government. And so you might end up with a kind of horizontal government structure that still has a state that is either supportive or at least neutral to it. There's a big difference between that and having a state that is kind of actively working against kind of initiatives that are being created by environmental NGOs, but really have no support and are working against, say, administrative. Big difference between those, and in the case where you have a government that's antithetic to pro-climate action, we're not going to get very far. I think that is fair to say, even with all some civil society. But is the horizontal model kind of inherently anti-democratic? I'm not sure I agree, actually, in the sense that, yes, you could have billionaires who are going to do various things. That's going to be a problem in any world, right? But the idea that governance is not just through the formal organs of the state, but involves civil society, it involves churches and universities and coalitions and transnational networks of judges and all kinds of experts. That seems actually quite consistent with my idea of democracy, right? That democracy is more than just, or liberal democracy is more than just elections. It's also about having space for civil society, for participation in governance, with, of course, some limit to that, right? So if we ever got to the point where the horizontal model was creating forms of governance that were somehow overpowering national governance, of course that would be a problem. But I think we are a million miles away.
Yes.
Thank you. I'm Benedict Seidler. I'm a political researcher from the University of Vienna. Thank you very much for your talk. I just wanted to take up the notion of climate realism and ask what extent you think the financial market or global financial system actors have reached kind of a point of climate realism, and if they had not, would be my hunch in the first place is what would happen if they do, because part of what they do is assess risk, price risk, and then find investors to insure against it or not, whatever. And you mentioned the problem of insurability.
Yeah.
So if they assess, for example, short-term risk of climate change much stronger than the long-term benefits of investment in aviation, for example, would we see kind of a divergence of efforts in the short-term adaptation that will be necessary, will be increasingly necessary for especially big market players, because they are probably the ones with the money to insure themselves against immediate impacts more easily, let's put it like that. And will that take in the end money away from long-term solutions that would address the problem at the root cause?
So the way I would think about what's happening in the finance sector right now is not that they have fundamentally changed how they think about climate risk. I think smart financial investors were already thinking about environmental risks before the term ESG ever came along. They continue to think about it now, even though it's gone out of fashion, and they were thinking about it at the peak of the fashion, right? So this is something that risks to dollars and cents. Like, this is what you get paid for if you're an active investor, and so they continue to work with that. The thing that probably has changed over time, there has been some modulation to, is the degree to which kind of captains of industry, the people who show up at Davos or what have you, feel that part of their role is to engage with climate solutions or climate policy, or climate activity, and that I think has had a kind of rise and fall, right, where climate change really was a top tier issue at Davos and various other kind of private sector engagements that isn't true. That has changed, and that in fact all the CEOs are sort of running away from the topic, and that's just sad from my perspective, but it is what it is.
Thank you very much, and I agree with your point about the possible limitations of the kind of horizontal and vertical access to propose something like a diagonal, which is a kind of mix of NGOs and states and civil society groups, in a sense, to move around. And actually, it's at the combination of the vertical and horizontal, which is quite important. You didn't, until the very end at least, didn't talk very much about specific people or organizations. You talked about that you're working with firms, companies.
Yeah.
Can you give us an example, let's say, of an organization? Greenpeace, of course, is the classic example, but an environmental group that's done this well, that in a sense has worked on that diagonal in terms of it comes out of horizontal relations, but they're good in terms of working with the state, that have actually we can use as an example in terms of how to drive environmental politics. Are there, you think, good examples that the industry can look to as kind of leaders in terms of how they've done this very well? In a world, as you say, with a lot of headwinds, it's difficult, but there must be some examples in which they've made very good progress.
That is a great question. I'm going to struggle with this because I even as you've been talking, I've been thinking about sort of 3 or 4 different names that popped into my mind of like, oh, here's an organization that had a little bit of success. Like SBTI was kind of at least had a period of real success. Right? It was a science-based targets initiative that helped corporations think about whether their activities were on. And then, of course, they've sort of run into various kinds of controversies as well. And so I don't know if I would call them a role model to succeed. There may be others in the room that have them, but I'm going to have to think a little bit about which ones that I would point to as kind of like the best practices case. Whatever. It's a hard problem, and the different movements, right? What success looks like might be very different to different actors. And so you get a group like 350.org that was big in launching the sort of fossil fuel divestment campaign. And they struggled at first where they couldn't kind of get anyone to sign on. And then they sort of had this breakthrough period, sort of roughly 2015 to 2021, where they got a lot of big organizations, big asset holders to say, okay, we're on board. We are at least going to divest from coal, which is kind of the easiest target, and maybe even a little bit farther from fossil fuels generally. So my own university, for instance, there was a movement, students wanted to pull out of fossil fuels. And Brown University now says, well, we didn't do it for climate reasons, but we have actually divested from fossil fuels. So this is like weird language around it. But there was some success in terms of activating actors to do this. Does that success in terms of bringing people in, like universities, to say we're going to divest, does that translate into environmental success in terms of actually reducing fossil fuel consumption or emissions or what have you? Much harder question, and I'm not sure who I would point to as like real success story. I wish I had a happier answer. And probably are, Tom Hale, if you were here, might have.
Since you are a prominent author of 2 books on petroaggression and partial hegemony, I want to make a bit connection with what you were saying today and ask you, what are the consequences of various strategies chosen for strengthening or weakening of EU role in the as an international actor? Because I suppose that China, what will happen to as a result of transition and which strategies?
Well, so Brendan and I were actually talking a little bit about this morning, where when I think about the EU's strategy on climate change, what is lovely and what I admire about Europe so much is that it has been a relatively high ambition region that has been pushing for decarbonization and has been leading by example, actually sort of walking the walk to a certain degree. And yet, I think there are limits to how far out on a limb Europe can get in terms of separating itself from the other major economies of the world, right? Of the United States, of China, of other actors, where if it separates itself and then doesn't also deliver on serious economic growth, right? That's going to be the real litmus test, is that can you decarbonize and continue to grow your economy, continue to have innovation, productivity? That's the real test. And so Europe, in my mind, is sort of getting a pretty good check mark on the climate side, and now needs to really prove that it can grow and sort of reinvest in its economy and its growth model, because that would be, to me, like such a powerful example for the rest of the world to say, wow, like look at what they're doing. And that's what that to give China credit, that's what they have done with solar and wind and batteries and EVs to a certain extent, right? Where their economy continues to grow like gangbusters, and they've grown all of this green tech. And that has really shaken up the world. So I'm saying, wow, that is possible. They are bringing the cost of EVs way down, and we have to figure out how to do what they're doing. Are they doing everything right? Absolutely not. They're still using tons and tons of coal, and we need to work on that. But like that part of it is really impressive. And so when I see the Trump administration making a big, heavy bet on fossil fuel legacy technologies, right, and putting a lot of advantages to the fossil fuel industry, I think that that's not a wise, far-sighted strategy. Right? That is a bet on yesterday's technology and not.
Brendan, I think you raised your hand, right?
Yes. Also, this lady's been waiting. Would you like to go first?
That I haven't seen.
Yeah, if I may.
Yeah, no,
Thank
please.
you. Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you very much, Dr. Colgan, for your wonderful presentation. I've learned a lot as a political scientist before.
Thank you.
Thank you. I fully appreciate your adoption of vertical and horizontal model, especially in combination with two-level games theory and realism, which I really think also a very strong explanatory power for this climate related implications for the global financial governance system. And I would just like to see bit clarification from you about my understanding, which could be wrong, of your horizontal lens. In my view, it's actually also a complex web combining vertical elements as well, in a way, right? Because it's transnational interactions and international ones as well, right? Between different international and domestic level actors as well as transnational actors, right? Yeah. So if this is the case, then how does this combination of the vertical and horizontal perspectives help you to enhance clarity or even simplify or further complicate your empirical research and methodology?
Yeah.
See what I mean, right?
Yes, thank you.
If this vertical perspective itself is a mixture.
Yeah.
Not the vertical, horizontal level is itself a mixture of vertical and transnational.
So one of the things that me and my co-authors have been talking a lot about is, if there were states involved in what is otherwise a kind of transnational governance initiative, like say out of the Glasgow COP meetings, there was a number of financial alliances or net zero alliances that were, powered by civil society, by private actors, banks, insurance companies, but also had state governments involved. We spend a fair bit of time wondering, okay, so is that a case of pure horizontal governance or not? And we decided that yes, it is, but the litmus test in terms of distinguishing that from vertical model is really whether there's binding state policy. And so where we see binding state policy, where national governments are getting involved by putting in kind of regulations, that looks like sort of the old-fashioned neoclassical top-down governance model. But what we're seeing now is that we sort of need a different way of understanding, right? So that's what the horizontal model is, and to a certain extent, this is drawing on what is now actually a fairly well-established literature on transnational governance, right? That this is something that is familiar to people who have been looking at these kinds of issues. We're applying it to the finance sector, and in particular, the interaction between the finance sector and climate policy to sort of try to make sense of all of these developments that are happening right now. Right? So that was the idea, is that we should have these two models in our brain, not because either one of them is better, but that we need both of them just to make sense of what we see.
Yeah, I mean, it's getting late. So a short question about mitigation and adaptation and climate realism. The story goes like this: whatever we have done since onset, every year emissions are going up. Growth is needed. Green growth we haven't achieved. It will go up. And mitigation, out of 200 countries in the world, 20 discuss mitigation. The rest are either not concerned for the moment because it's too long term, or they are already preparing for adaptation. How do you see climate realism and a shift from avoiding the problem by saying, let's face the consequences? And people invest into the Arctic melting, Greenland, and so on, all on the assumption that it's happening. But there's a community that already has accepted we will not meet the target. And we need to have completely different approach to thinking. And how does the investor community see that type of climate realism?
So, I mean, there is something very good about climate realism and something quite dangerous, right? So the good part is exactly this, that the reality that we are very likely to miss Paris targets. That is something that we should be clear-eyed about, and that government policymakers need to be clear-eyed about when they're making decisions about how to form alliances, allocate military bases, etc. And so it's not surprising that we are suddenly seeing a lot more interest in Greenland and the Arctic region in general when we have a world in which the idea that we're going to keep our Paris targets seems less and less plausible. And yet, that does not imply that we need to give up on the idea that we need to act as quickly as we can to get to some sort of net zero world, because the part that climate realism, I think, really doesn't want to recommend is, okay, let's have a very clear-eyed view about what it means to get to 3 or 3.5 degrees Celsius warming. It's awful, right? It does not look pretty. And the basic problem structure of there being a very bad cost in the future that could be avoided by a large but smaller than the big cost now, right? If we mitigate it now, that is a less costly solution. Is it hard to get there? Yes. But that basic problem structure gives you some hope that we can get to the less costly solution, right? This is kind of classic prisoner's dilemma type outcomes. And is it harder in climate change? Absolutely, right? And I think a number of us have spent sort of years sort of pulling our hair out about how hard it is. But there is, that's no cause for giving up, right? And that's essentially what climate realism, without wanting to say so, they're really saying, look, we're going to make a bargain here of giving up on short-term mitigation in exchange for potentially building a broader domestic coalition for a set of policy priorities, maybe including solar geoengineering to mitigate the long term.
And Brendan,
yes, I just wanted to come. Gentleman's question here: was there an example of horizontal and vertical management? There's one that we've just worked on in the European Union, the methane pledge, the oil and gas methane partnership. The oil and gas methane partnership started as a voluntary requirement amongst companies, and it now covers, I think, 60 or 70% of global oil and gas. It's a voluntary standard, which the European Union and the United States at the time encouraged to create that standard with the intention that the standard, once it was adopted by the companies, would be translated into European Union law, which has in fact happened now, and has become the gatekeeper for access to the European Union's market. So, and the reason we chose that particular method to go through the United Nations was to Trump-proof it. That's one thing, but this was under Biden, to make sure it was WTO compatible, also to get companies into the process, and also to make sure that it wasn't seen as a European Union standard, although from a physical perspective, we actually wrote it and then handed it to the companies, and then they adopted it, and then we took it back and turned it into legislation. So it does happen. It's quite a common strategy in European Union regulation to do this. We've done it in forestry and other areas. So it is quite common, and there are a lot of examples, at least that I'm aware of in Brussels, that fit the question. Do you have an example? Yes, we have many.
Thank you.
Thank you for the answer. Now, I have one final one, which is pretty generic, right?
Okay. And before we look at everybody.
Because you spoke about salience at the beginning, okay? And I was just wondering whether you ever can foresee an election being won on an environmental kind of platform. In other words, what are the conditions under which the salience becomes? We have examples of elections that the environment becomes really important to the electorate in order to vote. Because so far we've been seeing that people are thinking of financial cost, their own cost, and then they vote negatively.
Yeah, it's a great question. I mean, look, our prediction, and by our I mean Tom Hale and Jessica Green and I, when we wrote this article a few years back, was to say that what we expected was political contestation over climate change would increase over time. What we were not predicting was that, oh yes, the climate vote will get better over time. What we were just saying is that this would become more and more a central feature of various partisan divides. And I think at least insofar as one can test this kind of prediction over a relatively short period of time, it bears out pretty well. That especially in the US, it's got more and more part of the culture. But the question you're asking is a really interesting one. I mean, the one thing that I would point to actually is a state level initiative that was kind of really interesting in Washington State, where there was a carbon tax that was put as a ballot initiative to the voters twice. Both times the voters said, no, we don't want a carbon tax initiative. And then the governor and the state legislature said, we're going to do it anyway. We're going to put in place the carbon fee, and we're going to use the money raised from this to do a bunch of good things, such as the mass transit and other initiatives in the state. And sure enough, there was then a third ballot initiative where somebody on the right was saying, this carbon tax is not what you voted for. We need to get rid of it. Let's pull it back. And much to our surprise, the voters said, no, actually, now that it's in place, we like it. And the voters voted in favor of it at a higher rate than they voted for Kamala Harris, the Democratic candidate. So it is possible for Greens to win on policy. And so that is doable. But there is kind of, it's complicated by voters wanting certainty about what exactly the Greens are pushing. Right? They want to experience it. And this is, I think we're seeing the same thing in New York City right now with congestion policy, congestion pricing. It was quite controversial coming in, and now that it's in, people love it, right? This is actually a great policy. And so that kind of willingness of political actors to take the leap into the unknown and give something that they think voters are going to like, it takes courage as a politician to do that. But it is possible, and there are examples of that. Thanks so much.
Yeah, thanks, Jeff. I mean, from the number of questions today, one would have thought that there were 200 people in the room because there was so many. Thank you so much for generating all this. Almost everybody asked a question here. So thank you so much for having this.
I
can just
Thanks so much for coming to the talk.
Oh, very good. Most interesting. Thank you so much. This subject will run and run.
Yeah, right. It's not going anywhere.
Well,
This is
politics.
No, because there's
Pretty on the fast part.
Oh, yeah.
So
Yeah. And
and the
So they get the opportunity, they get sick of that, they can adjust their behavior. I think it's not to have it all just as sort of.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Definitely. And we're
it's big family.
to
I mean, everybody can sort of fix
I don't know, we've gone with
Well, we were up hoping they come from New York and put it out. That's in the same as Othon. Oh yeah,
Like I haven't
road attack, yeah.
Because at the same time, there's
So
the thing is, well, but it's more just, it's more socially just.
The tacker. I mean, they're all
well, so I like I put them in
They don't.
It's better to, yeah, people are sure doing things different. We should stop doing it.
I think like
Yeah, hundreds students. Following the watching the whole lecture without having any chance to always examine and what they do then.
You saw my face because there's a lot of people who think that kind of transnational governance is very undemocratic. Yeah, I mean, like there's in the finance space, there's a lot of people who say these regulators are pushing policies that the people in the states themselves don't want. And they negotiate agreements at an international level, and they force everybody to adopt it. It's like extremely
So yeah. So this comes up in my class all the time. Actually, people are like, "Center bankers are like, what's going on with this? Why are they involved?"
But interesting analogy, you know, who's central to financing. But does it? Did they give the central bankers a mandate to stop terrorists and money? I don't think they did. They're just breaking it. Yeah, but that's not it's ideological. That's my point. It's not actually like that's in their mandate. It's like they.
There is more. There's like more. It's like for.
No. I mean.
This is what this seeking alternative is.
No, so in that way it's different, but I would just say that many of the countries that have used poison on them, this is not a democratic program at all. It in no way reflects. Yeah, so it's true in the United States. People are like, yes, patriot. Yeah, in that case, it is.
Like this.
Politically, like
Many of the examples are only Westerners. Here again, I'm sure state AGs that are suing against them. That's very much of the crime. But like a more ancient idea. I don't think it is the case that
no, for sure.
It's more complicated. It's a space of civil society that is in a way that it's incomparable to
I would say it's akin to be a space of corporations. That's where technologies workers, which is probably also in some ways not democratic.
Bring it to universities, right? Of like, I think of universities as an important part of civil society that is not necessarily responsible for democratic government, and that's lovely. And it's part of what liberal democracy means. Is it's a government that Trump tells corporate what to change. That's not okay. Right?
But that's about like democratic principles, not being university.
What I'm saying is that civil society is patience, and what it means to be liberal democracy is not that all power is invested in actors who are elected. Right? The power is diffused in various ways outside of just the government or the top person.
Yeah.
Is that
Yes.
So we're going to meet in the Old Fellows dining room for a drink in 10 minutes.
Put you down. Thanks for the talk, see?
Yeah, we're picking up on your questions.
Well, I was thinking constantly in my head because I think because we're not going to solve it. And I make sure to move on.